Greetings. My name's Spencer Little. I'm part of the Such and Such editorial committee. We recently published this little publication, occasionally periodical. It's got a lot of really neat stuff, a lot of stuff about Southern Colorado, some poetry, fiction, paintings, different things like that. What I'm going to be doing today is reading a short story that I wrote from the occasional periodical. The story is called In 10th Century. It's a short fiction based on the very real Arthur Carhart. I encourage you to look up Arthur Carhart. He was a recreational engineer. Well, you'll hear a bit of the story later on. So thanks for joining us, and without further ado, let me get started. Sin Peterson opened her front door almost as soon as our protagonist had knocked. "Oh, excuse me," the man behind the door murmured. "You're from the magazine, right? Please come in," Sin beamed. She was older than her physique implied, and the home smelled like fresh-baked zucchini bread. She offered this treat to her guest repeatedly during their short meeting about some items in Sin's personal collection. Sin couldn't seem to remember her guest's name, though she never forgot his purpose. This man was a writer for the State Historical Society's Mountain Lore publication. He was researching Carter Carhart, a landscape architect who had developed some campgrounds in the forest surrounding Wellfield, the small mountain community where Sin lived. This was the fifth house our author had visited in the past 2 months, preparation for an article to enshroud this little-known piece of regional history. So far, his story went like this. Carter Carhart was born in the fall of 1893. He grew up in the Midwest, studying sanitation at Great Lakes University. Following his studies, Carhart enlisted as a sanitation specialist for the Army. In this service, young Carter instructed his superiors on camp design to maximize efficiency in waste management, housing, and kitchen placement. Carhart saw a lack of a unified landscape philosophy as the cause of much of the illness and discomfort experienced by soldiers in wartime. His blueprints were used as a standard in the military from then on, guiding installations from the Balkans to the Nile. These formative experiences birthed the next steps in his professional life. Upon returning to the States, Carhart began to dream of moving west to Colorado, seeking streams thick with trout. Coincidentally, the National Forest Service had just opened a new position for which Carhart was perfectly matched. At the age of 26, Carter Carhart became the first recreational engineer employed within the Forest Service. Where the feds wanted to fund recreation in the national parks, Carhart recognized the need for funding in the national forests around the city of Hente, Colorado, for development of campgrounds and waste management. It seemed suddenly, in 1919, that every family had a car to drive to the woods to drink beer, turning around, leaving rogue fire pits and empties. The problem was especially noticeable around Hente, where the West's largest steel mill had recently come up against striking laborers who demanded shorter work weeks and better access to outdoor opportunities. Like in the Army, Carhart created a plan to utilize minimal space to accommodate the most people, thereby concentrating the effect of casual grazers. With these plans in hand, Carhart established a dozen sites near Wellfield, equipped with latrines, picnic shelters, water wells, trash pits, and ample parking. Carhart's designs brought more people into the St. Francis forest than ever before, but his carefully considered landscape philosophy protected the forest from these weekend warriors. These plans soon became standard in the Forest Service, too. It was only a few years in that Carhart became bored with his post and left. He lived quietly for the rest of his life, and to this day, 100 years after the fact, his plans are still the basis of campground design across the country. In the last few years of his life, Carhart pursued a career as a writer. Subject matter varied from the breeding patterns of greenback cutthroats, the diet of red tails, to children's books on cat-faced spiders. It was this children's book, Goldie the Catface, that our author found in Sin's collection. Luckily, he was able to take it home to study for his article. Our author's home is like an 18th century curio cabinet. In addition to his interest in history, the man also collected entomological specimens, Motown records, and early world maps, just to name a few. The several items he had been loaned for his Carhart research went unnoticed among the myriad oddities. To add to this 18th century collector bend, our author also refused most modern conveniences, conducting all correspondence by hand and seldom answering his phone. And, while this man was a nifty historian, he was no archivist. All the rare and delicate first edition books he had been loaned were set precariously, atop, for example, a carved wooden figure of Ganapatea, or just in line of a spilled coffee. Similarly, his habits of handwriting extended to his professional career, and he jotted all of his notes on paper stored inside these loaned books, stuffing numbered excerpts between the crumpling pages. Strangely, as time for the publication pressed nearer, the finishing touches being put to paper and tucked inside 70-year-old books, our author began misplacing things. It seemed there was some inexplicable force which was causing these artifacts to vanish. The first thing he noticed to go was a first edition of a book Carhart had written on the mating patterns of greenback cutthroat trout. This particular book vanished slowly over the course of days. First, a friend's dog ate the cover. The next mishap was when our author knocked his coffee on a Venetian lamp, spilling it atop the book, turning many of the fresh white pages brown and the old brown pages older and browner. To add insult to injury, our author fell asleep that afternoon because of a lack of coffee. Remember, he spilled it on the desk. Consequently, he fell asleep with his cigarette burning, leaving a black circle that descends midway through the vintage book. Other objects began to decompose at an unnatural rate. A box of original letters, field books, journals, and a uniform, borrowed on a special researcher's permission from the local library, began to grow a slimy and hairy mass of moss, seemingly over the lunch hour. As he pulled bits off from in between pages, our author seemed to be encouraging further growth. In his panic, our author took the entire box and put it in a trash sack in a cupboard to suffocate the mosses. That would be the last time our author would see this box, for the next time he had checked, even the trash bag had disappeared. The magazine article was due in just a few days, and the magazine had hoped to get this piece to their chief editor, as it was the longest slated for this issue. The magazine was also aware of the author's annoying habit of sending in typed manuscripts via the mail, rather than sending an e-copy. This cost days to ship, and the magazine continued calling, frantic to get the piece. The author ignored all calls, unsure how he would possibly prepare an article in mere days. Our author decided that the best way to clear his mind was to walk to the place he had been obsessing over for the past several months. Squirrel Creek, the first designated campground within the National Forest System. As he got out of the car and began his walk, mid-afternoon in the dry season, he felt a sense of great relief. Our author imagined that he could quickly write this experience into the magazine article. It still commemorates the innovative man. Our author double-checked for his notebook and camera and continued his walk. Before long, the trail darkened. Heavy clouds filled the narrow valley of Squirrel Creek. The trail seemed so unfamiliar to the author, but he had a nervous excitement as he saw a way forward out of his predicament with the magazine. He seemed to get lost in a daydream as he trotted along. The clouds continued to thicken, obscuring what may lay just beyond. Further down the trail, our author's shoulders began to feel heavy. It felt as though there were ropes tied around the high part of his knees, with weights dangling down. His feet dragged, his head brayed. He continued walking. Our author didn't know how long he'd been walking or how long he'd need to be. Last time he had been out here, he was just a boy. Coming to a bend in the road, something happened that changed everything. Just ahead, standing to the right of the path, stood a buck. A large, beautiful animal, but not one of this world. Its face was glowing like an ember in blue. Each antler had a unique feature. The right side emitted corpuscles of light. The left showered ripples of warmth. The spirit gazed at the author. Though the author would not choose to look away, he seemed to have no choice. His head followed the trail, and his feet followed his head. Just ahead was Squirrel Creek Campground, ruins of the campsite Carhart had built. Only now, the place felt alive. The author continued his compelled march forward. In the clearing, a dozen men and women stood sky-clad with heavy soot body paint. In the middle of the circle sat a large tree stump, and piled all around it were images of Carhart, marigold flowers and incense, candles and corn. And sitting just behind the altar was a casket. As our author walked nearer the altar, the devotees stood silent in worship, arms raised to the full moon above. The author again felt these weights. His knees were forced to the ground. As soon as they touched the earth of the campground, our author received a sudden gnosis on his situation. In an instant, he learned that this was a group of international ecological magicians seeking to reanimate their hero, Arthur Carhart. This ritual was designed to reincorporate the material remains, all of Carhart's writings, wisdoms, and personalities, back into the corpse. These magicians were responsible for the destruction of the lost artifact. Their spell work was empowered with each bit of Carhart's chi they could harness from the world. This included the lost book on greenbacks, Carhart's Forest Service shirt, and all other paraphernalia siphoned to a world away. Things moved suddenly, as our author realized there was one more place where Carhart's words and deeds were stored that needed to be destroyed. As the ritual blade cut into his flesh, our author realized his sacrifice would complete the reanimation. Unfortunately, he would never publish this experience. Thanks for listening.